Harrison sat in his office, staring at the latest round of customer complaints about late deliveries and missing items. His delivery company had grown fast, 9 locations across the state, but lately, things weren't right. Drivers quitting, delays piling up, and customers furious. He had built the company from nothing, once driving deliveries himself. Now it felt like he was losing control. "Sir, I know you're frustrated, but these reports are vague," his district manager, Jordan, said. "We're hiring new drivers, but turnover is high. People complain about the workload, but it's the industry." Harrison frowned. "I don't run a company where people feel forced to quit. I need to see this for myself." Jordan hesitated. "You mean, I'm going undercover?" Harrison said firmly. He had never personally met most of the drivers. His face wasn't on the website, and the company had grown into a corporate-style business, making him just a name on a paycheck to the staff. With a beard, glasses, and a different hairstyle, no one would recognize him. The next morning, he walked into one of his busiest hubs, dressed in a faded hoodie and jeans. His new manager, Brian, barely looked up from his clipboard. "You the new guy?" "Yeah," Henry, Harrison said, using his middle name. Brian tossed him a clipboard. "Routes are rough today. Short-staffed. You'll ride with Mason until you get the hang of it." Mason, a thin guy with tired eyes, gave him a quick nod. "Hope you like driving fast," he muttered. As they loaded the van, Harrison noticed Mason wincing as he lifted a heavy box. "You all right?" "Just a pulled muscle," Mason said quickly. "Nothing major." The shift started, and Harrison immediately saw the problems. The GPS system was outdated, leading them in circles. Packages weren't sorted properly, making them waste time digging for the right ones. Customers were irate about delays, some even refusing deliveries out of frustration. Mason did his best, but Harrison could see the exhaustion in him. "You do this route every day?" Harrison asked. Mason let out a bitter laugh. "This? No, man. Last week I was covering another zone. Week before that, another one. People keep quitting, so they just move us around." Harrison's stomach tightened. "How many hours do you work?" "Depends. Officially, 40. Realistically, closer to 60. Overtime pay? Forget it." Harrison clenched his jaw. That was illegal. He had policies against this, but clearly someone was ignoring them. By evening, they had one last delivery. Mason hesitated when he saw the address. "Something wrong?" Harrison asked. "Nah, just. This one's mine." Harrison frowned. "Yours?" Mason sighed. "Yeah, I ship stuff to my place sometimes. Just put it by the door." They pulled up to a tiny, rundown house with a broken porch and peeling paint. Mason got out quickly, dropping the package by the door. But as he turned, the front door creaked open. A little girl peeked out. "Daddy." Harrison froze. Mason's face softened. "Hey, sweetheart. Go back inside. Okay?" The girl hesitated. But the lights went out again. Harrison glanced at the house. No lights. No sound of electricity running. His chest tightened. Mason forced a smile. "I'll fix it soon, promise." Harrison saw the exhaustion in Mason's eyes, the weight of a man barely holding it together. As they drove back, Harrison couldn't shake the image of that little girl in the dark. Something was very wrong in his company, and he was going to find out exactly what. Harrison walked into the warehouse the next morning, his body aching from the previous day's deliveries. The physical toll was one thing, but what weighed on him most was what he had seen at Mason's house. A hardworking employee barely scraping by, his daughter sitting in a dark house because he couldn't afford to keep the lights on. Something was deeply broken in his company, and he needed to understand exactly how far the problems ran. As he approached the loading area, he noticed a group of drivers gathered near the break room door. Their voices were low but tense. Mason was among them, his shoulders hunched as he listened. Brian, the warehouse manager, stood in front of them, arms crossed. His tone was clipped. "Look, I don't make the rules," Brian said. "If payroll says no overtime pay, then that's how it is. You don't like it, plenty of people looking for work." Harrison's stomach twisted. This was confirmation of what Mason had hinted at. He stepped closer, pretending to check his clipboard. A woman named Carla, another driver Harrison had met briefly the day before, exhaled sharply. "Brian, we're not asking for special treatment. We're just asking to be paid for the hours we work. My paycheck's been short 3 weeks in a row. Brian scoffed. Then maybe you're logging your time wrong. Mason shook his head. We don't log our own time. Dispatch does. And we're not getting the hours we actually work. It's not a mistake if it keeps happening. Brian's expression hardened. If you don't like the system, no one's forcing you to stay. Harrison felt his hands clench into fists. Employees weren't just overworked, they were being cheated. He had built this company to provide good jobs, not to exploit people. But clearly, Brian had no problem treating them as replaceable. The conversation ended when Brian walked off and the drivers dispersed, muttering under their breath. Mason turned, catching Harrison's eye. Come on, Henry, Mason said, voice tight. Long day ahead. As they loaded the van, Harrison decided to push for more information. You deal with this a lot? Mason gave a humorless chuckle. Only every week. People complain, nothing changes. Harrison frowned. No one's gone to corporate? Mason shot him a look. Corporate? You think they care? If they cared, it wouldn't be happening. Harrison swallowed hard. The worst part was Mason was talking about him. He did care, but somewhere along the line, the company had slipped from his control. He had trusted middle management to handle things, and they had let this happen right under his nose. They spent the morning pushing through deliveries, but Harrison noticed something else. Mason was slower today, wincing more often. You sure you're all right? Harrison asked as they climbed back into the van. Mason exhaled through his nose. Pulled muscles worse today, but I can't take time off. Harrison frowned. Why not? Mason hesitated, then muttered, no sick pay, and if I miss a shift, I won't make rent. Harrison's jaw tightened. No sick pay? He knew his company had policies for that. But if managers were ignoring overtime laws, they were probably cutting corners elsewhere too. The final straw came that afternoon. They were halfway through their route when Mason grabbed the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles whitening. What's wrong? Harrison asked. Mason took a breath. Just got a text from my landlord. If I don't pay the past due amount tonight, I'm out. Harrison felt a cold anger settle in his chest. This was a man working over 60 hours a week, breaking his body to keep up with the demands of the job, and he still couldn't afford stability. Mason shook his head. Guess I'll figure it out. That was it. Harrison couldn't stay silent any longer. By the time they got back to the warehouse, he had made his decision. He was done watching. It was time to act. Harrison stood in the warehouse, his pulse steady despite the storm raging inside him. He had seen enough. The long hours, the unpaid overtime, the hollow-eyed exhaustion of his employees of Mason. And now Mason was on the verge of losing his home despite working nonstop. That wasn't just mismanagement. That was failure. His failure. He walked toward the manager's office, his steps firm, his disguise still intact. Brian sat at his desk, casually scrolling through his phone, oblivious to the warehouse full of frustrated workers. Harrison didn't knock. Brian barely glanced up. You need something? Harrison shut the door behind him, his voice low but firm. I need answers. Brian arched a brow. About the overtime, the missing hours, the fact that people are working themselves to the bone and still struggling to survive. Brian leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. That's how it is. You're new, so maybe you don't get it yet. Harrison's patience was razor thin. Explain it to me. Brian exhaled through his nose, tapping his fingers on the desk. Look, the company sets expectations. We have quotas to meet, delivery times to hit. If I start giving out overtime like candy, we'll go over budget. The higher-ups don't want that. Harrison's stomach twisted. So instead, you rob people of what they've rightfully earned? Brian's eyes narrowed slightly. No one's being robbed. We just manage hours tightly. Harrison's fingers curled into his palm. People are being forced to work off the clock just to keep up. They're being told if they ask for what's owed, they can leave. That's not managing hours. That's exploitation. Brian's expression darkened. You can call it what you want, but it keeps the numbers where they need to be. Harrison's chest tightened. This wasn't just negligence. Brian knew what he was doing. I assume corporate doesn't know about this? Brian let out a dry chuckle. Corporate doesn't need to know. They care about results. As long as deliveries happen, no one's asking questions. Harrison held his gaze, his pulse steady despite the fury rising in him. He had trusted people like Brian to run his company with integrity. Instead, they had built a system where workers were disposable. There was nothing more to discuss. Harrison stepped out of the office and into the warehouse, his decision made. He walked to the center of the loading area where a few employees were stacking packages. Mason was among them, moving stiffly, exhaustion clear in his every motion. Harrison took a deep breath, then spoke loud enough for the entire room to hear. "My name isn't Henry." The warehouse went still. Mason frowned, confusion flickering across his face. Harrison pulled off his glasses, his voice clear and unwavering. "My name is Harrison Cole. I own this company." A stunned silence settled over the room. Eyes widened. People exchanged uncertain glances. Brian had stepped out of his office, his face suddenly pale. Mason's hands tightened at his sides. "You're joking?" Harrison shook his head. "I wish I was." A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. Carla crossed her arms, her expression wary. "So what, you came here to spy on us?" Harrison met her gaze directly. "I came here to see the truth for myself." "And I did." Brian finally stepped forward, his voice forced into something resembling control. "Sir, if I had known you were coming." Harrison turned toward him sharply. "That's exactly the problem. You didn't know. And because of that, you thought you could get away with cheating these workers out of their pay." Brian's mouth opened, then closed. Harrison scanned the faces of his employees. "I built this company to provide real jobs. Jobs that people could rely on. And instead, I found people breaking their backs just to stay afloat. That is not how this company will be run." The silence was thick with tension. Then Mason exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "So what happens now?" Harrison didn't hesitate. "Brian, you're done here. Effective immediately." Brian's face twisted. "You can't be serious." Harrison's voice was unwavering. "You've spent too long treating people like they're disposable. You knew what you were doing, and you did it anyway." Brian scoffed, but there was uncertainty beneath it. "Firing me doesn't change anything. The system is the system." Harrison's expression was cold. "Then the system is about to change." Brian hesitated, then stormed out, his steps sharp against the concrete floor. Harrison turned back to the workers. "From now on, every single hour worked will be paid. No exceptions. If you stay late, you get overtime. If you're sick, you get leave. If anyone tries to deny you that, you come directly to me." A few employees exchanged glances, skepticism still lingering. They had heard promises before. Mason studied him carefully. "And what about the people who are already behind? The ones who've been shorted for months?" Harrison nodded. "I will personally review every payroll record from the last 6 months. If anyone has been underpaid, they will get what they're owed." A beat of silence. Then Carla let out a breath. "You're really doing this?" Harrison met her gaze. "I have to." Slowly, the tension in the room shifted. There was still hesitation, still a layer of distrust. But there was also something else, something that hadn't been there before. A glimmer of hope. Mason exhaled, nodding slowly. "Guess we'll see." Harrison knew trust wouldn't be rebuilt overnight. But this was the first step, and he wasn't turning back. Harrison spent the next 48 hours unraveling the damage. He combed through payroll records, cross-referenced time logs, and spoke directly with employees. What he found only deepened his frustration. Unpaid overtime stretched back months, sometimes longer. Sick days had been denied without documentation. And worst of all, some employees had been pressured into signing off on incorrect hours, fearing termination if they refused. He called an immediate meeting with his regional managers. They gathered in the corporate office, shifting uncomfortably as they realized the tone of this meeting was different. Harrison sat at the head of the long conference table, weary but resolute. He wasted no time. He laid out the payroll discrepancies, the intimidation tactics, and the systemic neglect. Their reactions varied. Some looked genuinely shocked, others avoided eye contact. A few, like Jordan, the district manager who had originally dismissed Harrison's concerns, stiffened in their seats. He demanded answers. Some managers claimed ignorance, others admitted they had deferred to Brian's authority, assuming he was following corporate policies. But Jordan hesitated too long when Harrison asked how much he had known. That was enough of an answer. Without raising his voice, Harrison made it clear this wasn't a discussion. Jordan was out. So were 2 other managers who had been complicit in enforcing these unethical policies. The rest were given a final warning: change how they operated or step aside. After the meeting, he returned to the warehouse. Employees were still skeptical. He didn't blame them. Words meant little when they had been ignored for so long. So he focused on action. The back pay was processed within 48 hours. Every worker who had been shorted saw the difference in their accounts. The first checks arrived, and the warehouse buzzed with cautious disbelief. Some employees checked their phones twice, expecting a mistake. Others approached Carla, who had become an unofficial representative for the group, asking if it was real. It was. Harrison didn't stop there. He introduced a new payroll oversight system, ensuring no hours would be altered without direct approval from employees. A compliance officer was hired to audit timekeeping regularly. He also restructured scheduling, reducing the absurdly long shifts that had driven workers to exhaustion. But there was one last thing he had to do. He found Mason near the loading dock, scanning over the new route assignments. His movements were slower than before, his body still recovering from the strain of the last few weeks. When he noticed Harrison approaching, his expression was unreadable. Harrison didn't waste time. He told Mason his overdue wages had been deposited, including a hardship bonus to cover his immediate expenses. Mason didn't react at first, absorbing the words. Then, after a long pause, he exhaled. He wasn't the type to offer gratitude easily. Harrison could see that. Mason had spent too long being let down. But there was something in the way his shoulders eased, the slight nod he gave, that told Harrison everything he needed to know. Before leaving, Harrison addressed the entire warehouse one last time. He didn't make grand promises. Instead, he told them the truth: things had been broken, and it was his fault for not seeing it sooner. He wasn't asking for their trust immediately, only the chance to earn it back. As he left the warehouse that evening, the sun dipping below the horizon, he knew this wasn't the end of the work. It wasn't enough to fix things once. He had to make sure they stayed fixed. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was leading the company he had always intended to build. And that, he knew, was just the beginning. Harrison arrived at the warehouse earlier than usual, stepping into the quiet space before the morning shift began. The air was thick with the scent of cardboard and diesel, the faint hum of refrigeration units the only sound in the cavernous building. He had spent the last several days restructuring policies and ensuring payroll corrections were processed. But real change wasn't about paperwork. It was about people, and that meant staying involved. A few workers trickled in, their movements sluggish from early morning fatigue. Some glanced his way, still adjusting to the fact that their CEO was walking the floor like any other employee. Carla passed by, giving him a curt nod before heading toward the loading bay. Mason arrived soon after, his posture a little less rigid than before, but the exhaustion in his eyes remained. Harrison approached him, keeping his tone even. He wasn't here to make a spectacle. He needed to understand how things were really settling in. Mason was stacking smaller parcels onto a pallet, his movements slower than usual as he adjusted for a lingering ache in his shoulder. Harrison didn't comment on it. Instead, he focused on the task at hand. The two worked in silence for a few minutes before Mason finally spoke, his voice low. "You still planning on sticking around, or was all this just a one-time thing?" Harrison expected the skepticism. It was fair. Too many workers had seen management make promises only to disappear once the dust settled. He tightened the strap on a bundle of packages before responding. "I didn't come here just to fix a few numbers and walk away," he said. "I should have been paying attention a long time ago. I won't make that mistake again." Mason studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he shifted his stance and adjusted the weight of a heavier box. "Guess we'll see," Mason muttered, though there was something different in his tone. Less doubt. Maybe even the beginnings of belief. Harrison let the silence settle between them. Trust wouldn't come overnight. He had learned that much. As more employees arrived and the usual pre-shift chaos began, Harrison observed the changes. The mood was still cautious, but the undercurrent of frustration had eased. Workers weren't rushing to clock in early just to keep up with overwhelming routes. The tension that had once defined every morning was starting to lift. But he wasn't naive. Fixing payroll was only one piece of the problem. There were deeper issues to address. He made his way toward the dispatch area, where route assignments were being finalized. The supervisor on duty, a woman named Lisa, was reviewing the day's schedules. Unlike Brian, she had been one of the few managers who had pushed back against unfair policies, though her voice had often been drowned out. She glanced up as he approached, her expression wary but professional. "I assume you're not just here for a morning walk," she said, flipping through a clipboard. Harrison motioned toward the route board. "I want to see how things are running now that the scheduling changes are in place." Lisa exhaled, rubbing the back of her neck. "Better, but it's an adjustment. Drivers are still getting used to having realistic delivery windows instead of being overloaded. Some of them don't trust it'll last. They keep pushing themselves because they're used to the old way." Harrison nodded. "That's going to take time." She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "There's another issue. Equipment." That caught his attention. Lisa gestured toward the loading dock, where a few drivers were inspecting their vans before heading out. Some of these vehicles should have been replaced a long time ago. Maintenance requests were ignored for months. Now that people actually have time to check their vehicles properly, they're realizing how bad it is. Harrison's jaw tightened. Another problem swept under the rug. "How bad are we talking?" Lisa crossed her arms. "Brakes wearing thin, electrical issues, faulty GPS systems. Nothing catastrophic yet, but if we don't fix it now, it will be." Harrison made a mental note to pull the maintenance logs. If repairs had been neglected, that meant someone had been signing off on unsafe vehicles without addressing the issues. He turned back toward the warehouse floor, scanning the space with fresh eyes. The problems ran deeper than he had realized, but that only solidified his next steps. Accountability wasn't just about cutting out bad management. It was about rebuilding from the ground up, ensuring that the people keeping this company running weren't being forced to work with broken systems. As the first vans rolled out for the day, Harrison made a decision. He wasn't just going to oversee these changes from a distance. He was going back out on the road. He needed to see firsthand if things were truly improving or if there were still cracks being hidden beneath the surface.